There is something almost sacred about a man who makes the world laugh. You don't question it, you don't look beneath it, you simply receive the gift and you are grateful. For decades, Rowan Atkinson gave that gift without asking for anything in return: a rubber face, a tilted head, a silence so expressive it needed no words. And the world, every single corner of it, laughed in exactly the same language. Children in villages who had never left their hometown, grandparents in living rooms on the other side of the earth. People who shared nothing else in common, laughing at the same moment at the same man. But here is the thing about people who spend their lives hiding behind a character. Eventually, the weight of that character becomes too much to carry quietly. At 71, Rowan Atkinson said something that made people stop, not because it was scandalous, not because it was a crisis. Because it was honest, quietly, deliberately, almost painfully honest. He spoke about the character that made him one of the most recognized human beings on the planet, and what living inside that character actually took from him. Fans heard it and felt something shift. Not quite shock, something closer to the strange, uncomfortable feeling of having sensed something for a very long time, and finally being told, yes, you were right. Because the most devoted fans always notice something, even through the laughter, even through the brilliant, breathtaking physical comedy, something behind his eyes never fully arrived at the joke. Something stayed just slightly apart from it. They could never explain it. They simply felt it the way you feel things that are true before you have the words for them. And now, after more than 4 decades, Rowan Atkinson has found the words himself. What he said is not a breakdown, it is not bitterness, it is something rarer than either of those things. It is the truth, and sometimes the truth, when it finally comes, is the most powerful thing a person can offer. Rowan Atkinson was born in 1955 in County Durham, a quiet and understated corner of northern England where the land stretches flat toward the horizon and the winters arrive early and stay long. He was the youngest of 4 brothers, raised in a household that was stable and comfortable but not particularly warm in the emotional sense. His father was a farmer and a businessman. Feelings in that house were not things that got examined out loud. They were managed quietly, privately, if they were acknowledged at all. He was a shy child. Not the mild, charming kind of shy that people eventually grow out of. The deep, persistent kind that follows you into every room and turns every simple interaction into something that requires effort. He stuttered. He struggled to find his footing with other children in the way that most children eventually do. The unspoken rules of how to be around people, how to read a room, how to belong somewhere, those things did not come easily to him. What he found, almost by accident, was performance. Not as a cure for the shyness, not as a sudden burst of confidence, more as a kind of translation. On a stage or in front of an audience, the rules became clear. There was a structure to it. A defined space. The audience had a role and he had a role. And success was something you could actually hear, in laughter, in applause, in the particular electric silence that falls just before a punchline lands. It was the only social space where the rules made complete sense to him. He studied electrical engineering at Newcastle University before earning a master's degree at the Queen's College, Oxford. At Oxford, he found his way into the comedy world that would eventually define everything that followed. The sketches, the early performances, the first careful experiments with physical expression that would, years later, evolve into something the world had genuinely never seen before. But even then, the people who knew him described the same quiet contradiction: brilliant, gifted beyond almost anyone they had encountered, and somehow still separate. As if there was always a thin layer of glass between Rowan Atkinson and every room he walked into. Present but not fully inside it, he rose with unusual speed. Television came quickly, and the British public embraced him with a kind of affection that bordered on possessiveness. And then, in 1990, came the character that would change everything: Mr. Bean arrived without warning and without explanation. A childlike, socially adrift man in a world that seemed permanently confused by his presence. Almost no dialogue. An enormous range of physical expression. A bizarre, somehow dignified insistence on surviving every situation the world threw at him. The show was strange. It was original. And it traveled in a way that almost nothing before it had managed to travel. The world did not simply enjoy Mr. Bean. The world absorbed him. People who had never shared a language shared the laughter. And the man at the center of it, the man whose face carried all of that, became something that very few performers in the history of entertainment have ever truly become. He became inescapable. What nobody fully understood at the time What perhaps even Rowan Atkinson himself had not yet fully understood was what it actually meant to spend a life being seen through the face of someone else. The reach of Mr. Bean defies easy explanation even now. Most successful comedy travels within borders. It depends on language, on cultural shorthand, on a shared understanding of how the world works in a particular place. Mr. Bean needed none of that. It moved through walls, rural villages in India, small towns in West Africa, households in Japan and Brazil and Saudi Arabia and Iceland. Children who had never heard a word of English, laughing until their sides hurt at a man they somehow understood completely. That is not simply popular. That is something close to a phenomenon of human communication. Something rare enough that it only happens a handful of times in a generation, if that. And Rowan Atkinson produced it with his body, with his timing, with the extraordinary instrument of his face. He used silence the way other comedians use words. He used stillness to build tension and movement to release it with a precision that was almost mathematical in its execution. Critics wrote about it. Academics analyzed it. And every time it appeared on a screen somewhere in the world, a new audience discovered it and felt exactly what the first audience had felt. By any measure, he had created something permanent. The kind of cultural mark that most performers spend entire careers reaching for without ever getting close. But beneath all of that, quietly and consistently, something else was happening. Every time he was asked to return to the character, for the films, for the charity specials, for the anniversary appearances, something inside him pulled back. Not visibly. Not in a way that made headlines or leaked into reviews. But the resistance was real, and it was steady, and it built the way pressure builds in something sealed too tightly for too long. He delivered the work with the same technical mastery every time. The audience always received what they came for. And yet people who worked closely with him described a version of him that emerged after a day of filming Mr. Bean that was harder to read. A quietness that was not tiredness. A withdrawal that people around him learned to recognize, even if they could not name it or fully understand what it meant. For years, he said almost nothing publicly about any of this. His interviews were careful, witty, often in that dry, precise British way, self-deprecating in a manner that kept the real conversation at a safe distance. He was never the kind of performer who sat across from a journalist and said the thing that genuinely cost him something to say. Not then. That would come much later. When Rowan Atkinson finally spoke plainly about his relationship with Mr. Bean, he did it without theater. There was no carefully staged moment of vulnerability, no carefully worded press release. He said it almost the way a person says something they have been carrying for a long time, not dramatically, but with the particular ease of someone who simply no longer sees the point in carrying it. He described playing Mr. Bean as something he found genuinely stressful, unrewarding in a way that playing Blackadder, his other beloved character, had never been. He did not frame it as a complaint. He said it as a fact, calmly and directly, in the tone of someone who has had long enough to understand exactly what they mean. Those two words, stressful, unrewarding, landed quietly at first. Then people began listening more carefully to what was beneath them. Blackadder gave him language, wit, the pleasure of a precisely constructed line finding its mark in exactly the right moment. It gave him collaboration, the energy of working alongside writers and fellow performers in a way that felt genuinely alive and creative. With Mr. Bean, there was something closer to isolation. The character exists in a sealed-off world where the comedy depends entirely on one person, on physical precision measured in fractions of a second, on a face being pushed into expressions that do not come naturally. Getting there, inhabiting that place, required Rowan Atkinson to go somewhere internal that, by his own account, he did not find comfortable. He also admitted something that many fans found quietly difficult to sit with. He did not feel a personal connection to the character, not the warmth of a creator looking back at something they love. Something more like the quiet obligation of a craftsman who returns, again and again, to work he executes flawlessly but does not particularly enjoy. For fans who had spent years projecting joy onto both the character and the man behind him, that distinction was a strange thing to absorb. Not devastating exactly, but honest in a way that changed the texture of everything they had watched. The delight on screen was real. That part was never in question, but it was carefully, painstakingly constructed. And the man constructing it, every single time, was somewhere else inside himself while he was doing it. There is a particular kind of famous that very few people in the world have ever experienced. Not famous in a country, or across a generation, or within an industry. but recognized immediately, completely, unavoidably, by hundreds of millions of people across virtually every culture on Earth. That kind of recognition does not leave room for an ordinary day. You cannot be frustrated in public without it becoming a story. You cannot walk slowly or look tired or simply exist in a neutral, unremarkable human way without someone watching, someone recognizing, someone waiting for the face to do what the face does on television. The scrutiny is constant, and it is specifically shaped because what people are always watching for is not you. It is the character they already love. People who crossed paths with Rowan Atkinson over the years described, with remarkable consistency, a man who seemed to be running a permanent internal negotiation between who he actually was and who every room expected him to be. He was exacting and precise about his work. He had deep, genuine interests that had nothing to do with performance, a lifelong passion for cars, a love of engineering that never left him from his university days. He was, by most accounts, far more at ease talking about the mechanics of a racing engine than about celebrity or emotion. But the world wanted Mr. Bean. At every appearance, in every interview, hovering just at the edge of every public moment, there was the expectation that the face would do the thing. That the man and the character were essentially the same person, interchangeable, inseparable. He resisted that expectation mostly. But resistance, sustained across decades, carries its own kind of cost. The character also reached into his private life in ways that are easy to overlook. His children grew up in the household of one of the most recognized people on Earth. His personal relationships, including his long marriage to actress Sunitra Sastry and his later relationship with Louise Ford, unfolded within the specific difficulty that comes when one person's public presence exists at a scale that ordinary life was never designed to accommodate. None of it was scandal. None of it made for dramatic headlines. It was simply the accumulation of years lived under a weight that most people are never asked to carry. What fans were really sensing, underneath all the laughter, underneath the joy of watching him, was a question they never quite managed to put into a sentence. Was he happy? Not happy in the way that means successful and photographed and celebrated, but happy in the private, unperformed sense. The kind of happy that exists when nobody is watching and there is nothing to prove, and the face can simply be a face. The answer Rowan Atkinson has offered, slowly and carefully across years of rare openness, is not a simple one. He has spoken about depression, not in the language of crisis or collapse. In the quieter language of someone describing something that has been a consistent presence in their life, something they have had to learn to recognize, carry, and manage without letting it define them entirely. He has discussed it with a matter-of-fact steadiness that somehow makes it more affecting, not less. As if he is simply reporting the truth of his experience, without asking for anything particular in return. He has also described the specific loneliness of having a public identity so fixed and so large that it leaves almost no visible space for the actual complexity of being human. Mr. Bean is loved without condition, across every border, across every generation. And Rowan Atkinson is the person who made that possible. But between the beloved character and the real man, there has always been a gap. And living inside that gap, year after year, decade after decade, has a texture that is genuinely difficult to describe to someone who has not experienced it. There is also something he has said about his own face. It sounds like a small thing, but it is not. His face was the instrument. It was what the world latched onto, recognized, projected onto, expected things from. Living inside a face that became a universal symbol, while also simply aging and feeling and being a complicated person with a private inner life, requires a kind of internal separation that most human beings never have to develop. He developed it out of necessity, and speaking about it now with the steadiness of someone who has had time to understand it, there is no bitterness in it. Just a clear-eyed accounting of what the work actually cost. The decision to step back, to say quietly and without apology that he is unlikely to return to Mr. Bean in any meaningful way has landed differently with different people. For some there is grief in it, genuine, soft grief. Mr. Bean was not simply entertainment for the people who grew up with him, he was comfort, he was reliability. He was one of those rare things that felt like it belonged to your childhood in a way that could always be returned to. The idea that the man behind it has set it down, has chosen not to return to that particular well, feels like a small but real loss. For others, the reaction is something quieter and perhaps more considered, a kind of respect. The recognition that a man who spent the better part of his adult life giving something that was genuinely costly to give has earned, fully and without argument, the right to stop giving it. And that his honesty about the experience does not diminish what he gave. If anything, knowing what it took from him adds a dimension to every clip, every sketch, every moment of laughter he produced. It makes the gift feel even more significant because it was never easy. He has also, in this period of his life, been willing to speak about things beyond the work itself. Questions of public discourse, of creative freedom, of the importance of honesty in spaces where honesty is increasingly uncomfortable. He has approached these things with the same careful precision he brings to everything, never reckless, never performing an opinion for the sake of attention, but not retreating into silence either. At 71, Rowan Atkinson remains himself, precise, thoughtful, still in some fundamental way the shy boy from County Durham who found that performance was the one place where the world made sense. The shyness never fully left. What changed is that he no longer seems to feel the need to apologize for it, or to perform his way past it, or to return to a character that never truly belonged to the man wearing it. There is something in all of this that reaches well beyond the story of a famous person and a famous character. It touches something most people have felt in some smaller, quieter version of their own lives. The gap between the person you are in private and the version of you that other people carry around in their heads. The effort of sustaining something that the people around you love, when sustaining it costs you something real. The slow, unglamorous negotiation between what the world needs from you and what you actually have left to give. Most of us will never experience that negotiation at the scale Rowan Atkinson has experienced it. But the negotiation itself, the basic shape of it, is something almost everyone recognizes. That is what makes his story land somewhere deeper than celebrity gossip or entertainment news. It is recognizably human, uncomfortably, honestly human. What he said at 71 was not a cry for sympathy, and it should not be received as one. It read as something closer to resolution. The quiet accounting of a man who has finally given himself permission to be honest about the full cost of what he built, not because he regrets building it, but because the truth held for long enough eventually asks to be spoken. Mr. Bean will not disappear. The clips will keep moving through the internet and into living rooms, and onto the screens of children who were not yet born when the show first aired. The laughter will keep finding new people, will keep crossing the same cultural and linguistic borders it always crossed, because that quality in the work is permanent now. It belongs to the world. And the world will keep it with the particular tenderness that people reserve for things that made them happy before they understood why happiness was something to value. And perhaps that permanence is what finally makes it possible for Rowan Atkinson to lay it down. The character no longer needs him to survive. It has outgrown the need for its creator. It exists now on its own terms, in its own space, entirely independent of the man who built it at considerable personal cost, and kept returning to it even when returning was hard. The character is free, and perhaps in the way that matters most privately so is he. For the fans who always sensed something unspoken in his performances, something behind the eyes that never quite arrived at the joke, his words did not bring sadness so much as a strange, settling sense of completion. The feeling of a story that has finally shown you all of its pieces, not neater than before, not simpler, but finally honestly whole. Rowan Atkinson spent decades making the world laugh. That was never the small or easy thing it looked like from the outside. At 71, he has offered something different, something quieter, and in its own way, something that required just as much courage. He offered the truth, and the people who always suspected it, the ones who watched closely and felt something they could not name, they deserved to hear it. If something in this story stayed with you, if it touched something you recognized in your own life, even in a small way, take a moment with that. We spend so much of our time watching the performance. We rarely stop to think about what it cost the person giving it. If this felt worth your time, consider subscribing. There are more stories here, told with the same care and the same patience. Stories about real people and what their lives actually looked like when the cameras stopped and the character was set aside. Leave a thought in the comments. What did you always sense about Rowan Atkinson that you could feel but never quite find the words for?